The night I finally listened to my gut. When I first met him, I was swept off my feet. He was everything I thought I wanted. Charming, funny, and attentive in ways that made me feel like the only person in the room. I thought I'd finally found someone who truly saw me. My friends adored him, my family approved, and everything seemed like it was falling into place. But after a few months, little things started to nag at me. I noticed he'd go silent for hours, often explaining it away as busy with work. He'd have a perfectly reasonable excuse every time, and I believed him. But then there were the missed calls, the times he'd cancel plans last minute, saying he was caught up with unexpected responsibilities. It didn't feel right, but I brushed it off as me being too sensitive or paranoid. One night, we'd planned to meet for dinner, and I was excited to spend some quality time together. I hadn't seen him much that week, so I was looking forward to catching up. But right as I was getting ready, he texted, "Sorry, something came up. I'll explain later." No further details, no phone call, just that. I felt that familiar pit in my stomach, the same feeling that had been creeping in more and more frequently. This time, though, I couldn't ignore it. I had that overwhelming urge to figure out what was really going on. I felt guilty for even considering it, but something inside told me I needed to follow this feeling. So, I decided to drive by his place on my way home, just to see if his car was there and if maybe he was okay. As I pulled up, I saw his car in the driveway. I felt a wave of relief mixed with a flood of confusion. If he was home, why hadn't he told me? Why the secrecy? I parked across the street and watched as lights flickered in his apartment. After a few minutes, he opened his front door to let someone out, a woman I didn't recognize. They exchanged a quick hug, and she left, getting into her car without glancing back. My heart dropped. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, and I couldn't move. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All those times I doubted myself, blamed my own insecurity, convinced myself I was overreacting, and here it was. Proof that I wasn't crazy after all. I drove home that night in silence, feeling numb. When he called later, I explained why he'd canceled. I listened to his excuses, letting him lie to me one last time. I didn't confront him immediately. I needed time to process everything. The next day, I asked to meet up and told him that I had seen him with the woman. He stumbled through his words, trying to deny it, then tried to turn the blame on me for spying on him. In that moment, I realized that I deserved so much more. I deserved honesty, respect, and someone who valued me enough not to hide things or make me feel like I was the problem. So, I ended things. Walking away was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but deep down, I knew it was the right choice. The day I stood up to my mother. Growing up, my mom was the center of my world. I was the youngest of 3, and she had this way of making me feel special, like I was her favorite. I hung on her every word, always eager to please her, and as a child, I never questioned her authority. Her praise felt like the ultimate validation, but her criticism, it cut deeper than anything else. As I got older, I started to notice the little ways she would undermine me. When I achieved something, she'd always find a way to point out a flaw, a small detail I'd missed, or how someone else had done it better. If I made a mistake, she'd remind me over and over, as if I needed to be reminded of my failures to learn from them. And every time I tried to stand up for myself, she'd accuse me of being ungrateful or selfish. One day, I got a promotion at work. It was a big deal for me. I'd worked long hours and pushed myself harder than ever. When I called her to share the news, she congratulated me, but only briefly. "I'm proud of you, but remember, don't let it get to your head," she said. "There's always someone working harder than you." It stung, but I pushed the feeling aside, convincing myself that she was just trying to keep me grounded. Then, on my birthday, we had dinner together. I was excited, hoping for a genuine celebration without any lessons or advice. I made a point to keep the conversation light, focusing on positive topics, but somehow it drifted back to my work. She started giving unsolicited advice, pointing out ways I could be doing more or trying harder. I could feel my heart sinking, the familiar disappointment washing over me. And just as I was about to brush it off, she said something that flipped a switch in me. "You know," she said with a slight smile, "if you spend as much energy on your career as you do on trying to impress me, you might get even further." It felt like a slap in the face. I sat there in silence, a rush of emotions flooding over me. All these years I had been bending over backward to win her approval, to make her proud, and here she was, trivializing my efforts as if they were nothing more than attempts to get her attention. I could feel the tears welling up, but something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let her diminish me anymore. I took a deep breath, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Mom, I love you, but I need you to know that your constant criticism hurts me. I work hard because I want to succeed, not because I need your approval. I need you to see me for who I am, not who you think I should be." For the first time, she was silent. I could see the shock in her eyes, as if she hadn't expected me to speak up. She stumbled over her words, trying to explain herself, to tell me that she was only trying to help. But I could see through it now. I could finally see that her words, her criticism, they weren't about me, they were about her own insecurities, her need to control, her fear of losing relevance in my life. That night, I left feeling both heartbroken and liberated. I knew that standing up to her would change our relationship, maybe even distance us, but I also knew it was necessary. For so long, I had let her words define my self-worth, but now I was ready to define it on my own terms. The day I realized she wasn't my friend. I had known her for years. We met in high school, and back then, she was my everything. The person I could laugh with for hours, the one who knew all my secrets and fears, and the one who seemed to understand me in ways no one else did. We shared everything, from weekend hangouts to late-night phone calls, talking about everything and nothing at all. If you'd asked me then, I would have told you she was my sister. But over time, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. Little comments that seemed harmless but left me questioning myself. If I shared an accomplishment, she would always find a way to one-up me. If I was going through a tough time, she'd somehow steer the conversation back to herself, making her problems seem so much bigger than mine. I always brushed it off, thinking, that's just how she is. I convinced myself that I was overthinking things, that maybe I was the one being sensitive. Things escalated when I got my first job after college. I was beyond excited. I'd worked so hard for that opportunity, and I couldn't wait to tell her. But when I did, her reaction wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of being happy for me, she gave me a half-hearted, "Oh, that's cool," and quickly changed the subject. It stung, but I tried not to let it bother me. She was my friend after all, maybe she was just having an off day. As time went on, the pattern continued. She would belittle my achievements, make jokes at my expense in front of others, and often disappear when I needed her the most. I remember one time in particular when I was going through a rough patch at work. I called her, hoping to vent and maybe get some advice, but instead of listening, she interrupted me, saying, "You think that's bad? Let me tell you about my day." She went on to talk about her own struggles, completely disregarding what I was going through. I started to feel drained every time we hung out. What used to be fun and comforting now felt like a chore, like I was constantly walking on eggshells, careful not to say or do anything that might set her off. I began to dread her calls, finding excuses not to see her. But despite all of this, I still couldn't bring myself to end the friendship. I kept holding on to the good memories, hoping that things would somehow go back to the way they used to be. The turning point came one day when I ran into an old friend from high school. We started chatting, and somehow the conversation drifted to my best friend. This friend looked at me with sympathy and said, "You know, she used to talk about you behind your back a lot." She went on to tell me things that left me speechless. Hurtful comments my best friend had made about me, things she'd shared that I'd told her in confidence. It felt like a punch to the gut. All these years, I had trusted her, confided in her, and she had betrayed me without a second thought. That night, I sat alone, replaying all the moments in our friendship that had hurt me, all the times I had ignored the red flags, convincing myself that I was just being sensitive. I realized that I had been clinging to a version of her that no longer existed, holding on to memories of a friendship that had become toxic. It was hard, but I knew what I had to do. The next day, I sent her a message. I didn't go into details or try to explain myself. I simply told her that I needed to focus on my own well-being and that I couldn't continue with the friendship. She responded with a short, dismissive text, and that was it. Just like that, years of friendship ended with a few words on a screen. It wasn't easy to move on. There were days I missed her, days I questioned if I had made the right choice. But slowly, I began to feel lighter. I reconnected with old friends, started focusing on my own goals, and discovered a newfound sense of self-worth. I learned that true friends lift you up, celebrate your achievements, and are there for you in your darkest moments. And though it was painful, letting go of her was one of the best decisions I ever made.